Good afternoon. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us is former Chief Ag Negotiator with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, Gregg Doud. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
So a new role into the agriculture industry. Let's talk a little bit about that and your transition to the private sector.
Well, my new role is I'm going to be Vice President of Global Strategic Intelligence and a Chief Economist for a company called Aimpoint Research out of Columbus, Ohio. These guys are really unique and really interesting. They come from a military background. So were West Point graduates, Army War College experts that are taking what they learned in that environment and applying it in the concept of global strategic intelligence and thought leadership and market research. And they do things like what they call war gaming, which is, really playing out scenarios and helping people think through, major changes in supply chains. We haven't seen anything like that in agriculture recently, right? And so this is a really unique opportunity to take my skill set, which has always been, as most of you know, as an economist for U.S. Wheat Associates and chief economist for the National Cattlemen, is I've always been kind of a commodity analyst and agriculture and a K-State trained ag economist. I'm not really that government affairs lobbying DC kind of guy. So this is really my wheelhouse, and this is an opportunity to join a firm in a really unique capacity, up and coming group of folks, and really, really looking forward to it.
When we look at what you're doing and what Aimpoint is doing, how is this important to the future of the ag sector when we think about data procurement, supply chains, and making sure our industry continues to function?
Well, the world is changing really rapidly, all in every capacity in terms of use of technology and adaptation in supply chains based upon all kinds of technology. The CEO of Aimpoint is Brett Scotto, is his name. Really interesting guy, a West Point graduate. One of the unique things that he's been traveling around the country, I think for the last year or so or more, giving speeches on a thing he calls the farmer of the future. And this is, what a U.S. farmer is going to look like in 20 years. And it is a fascinating presentation about the things that we have to think about going forward. So when you think in that capacity, you think of the day-to-day things happening in the world, what we call the intelligence aspect of it is how to match that up and help, thought leaders in agriculture know what's coming and how to react to it going forward. That's the business model, and really, really bright young group of folks that I'm going to be a part of here in that capacity. So it's we have to begin to not only understand the issues, but how to think about them and how are we going to adapt?
Agriculture did a lot of adapting in 2020. When we take a look back at this last year, through the pandemic, through the supply chain disruptions, what do we take from it, and how does that shape us and the business models for the industry moving forward?
Well, I think, it's a little bit of strengths and weaknesses. It's a little bit of, you have a situation right now in Texas and the power grid. It's all of these different things, some people call them black swan events, is, how do we think through these things? And that's really one of the things that I'm really amazed coming, spending the last few years in government. And from a government standpoint, having to think through these things on the fly, seeing the scenario building capacity that these guys have developed. They call it war gaming, but it's really, a simulation, a scenario of understanding and presenting variables and getting a group of really, really smart people in a particular industry together to understand how to think through these things. And then go home and apply them. And that's really a critical, important thing as well, that I think, you have, supply chain folks on the meat side of the equation, on the dairy side of the equation. But I think a lot of commodity groups, the Farm Bureau, the corn growers, et cetera, we have to get this down to the farm level as well, and help farmer leaders understand these changes, and be a part of that conversation. And that's, you know, these conversations have to occur if we're going to be successful in agriculture going forward.
Let's talk a little also in your wheelhouse, trade, as we look ahead to 2020 and take a quick look back. I mean, very successful 2020 in terms of trade agreements. As you look ahead, we know the global market plays a huge role in what's going to happen with profitability to all sectors of the ag industry. What are some opportunities if we're talking about SWOT analysis? So what are some opportunities for the ag industry looking forward, and some bright spots there?
Well, we had the USDA outlook this week, and they talked about, you know, the changes that have occurred in China, and the opportunities there. I want to back up, and I'll give you a few snippets from my old stump speech. How's that? Of just a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact. In our discussions with China, we made in the agreement, we made some 57 structural changes. There were 57 changes that China had to address just in agriculture alone. And I will tell you, there, in terms of completion, there's probably 52 or 3 or 4 of those that are done. And so one of the things to help people understand, well, what does that mean for us in agriculture? Well, that means before we started these conversations, now 2 years ago, and those conversations for me were 33 different negotiating sessions, the shortest of which would have been 4 hours by a video conference, the longest of which would have been a 10 or 12-hour day in Beijing or in Washington. We did 33 of those to get to these 57 things. Before we started the conversation, there were about 1,500 facilities in the US eligible to export their products to China. And I'm talking about grain facilities, beef processing facilities, dairy food facilities, pet food facilities, 1,500 of those. Today, we have well over 4,000 facilities eligible to export their products to China. And that really expands our ability to grow, not just in terms of dollars and volume, but expand the whole breadth of different things that we produce in the United States in agriculture, and have the ability to get those products to China. And so many of our conversations were about, you know, ultra filtered milk and Fairlife milk and new dairy products that China had no regulation to deal with. In this agreement, when you read through it, you say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that China has to facilitate a new regulation that allows us to get this product into China. And they've done these things. So this is, you know, not only have we changed the paradigm here with regard to our relationship and agricultural trade between the US and China, we've really broadened the scope of this, which means over time, the relationship is really good. Our ability to grow our exports to China is really going to expand. I think we're just on the front and leading edge of this going forward.
Are there other opportunities or other places that the ag industry should have their eyes and their sights set on when we look at expanding trade and increasing free trade access for U.S. goods?
There absolutely are. And it was a shame here in the last year, in the last 9 months that I was in that job, because of COVID, we weren't able to travel. But there were places that we had designs on going. I mean, we've made a lot of progress in Vietnam. Vietnam is going to be a place. Had some great conversations late last year with Indonesia. And, you know, Indonesia is a huge country, huge population. We made a lot of changes there late last year on the fruit and vegetable side. Great relationship blooming there. You know, all of Southeast Asia to me, whether it's the Philippines or Vietnam or Indonesia, it has great potential for us in U.S. agriculture. You know, you're going to see continued growth in Japan, continued growth in South Korea. You know, great relationship there in Taiwan. So to me, that's really the focus. The challenges are going to be with Europe. In particular, and especially their farm to fork initiative is going to be something that's going to drive us crazy here in the United States going forward. And I know Undersecretary McKinney and I, and a lot of folks spent a lot of time on India. That was extremely frustrating. It has a market that has great potential, but that's the word. You never really get past the word potential and having the ability to decrease the barriers to access that we have to India. That's, everybody thinks that's a great opportunity. We've spent so much time on it, and yet we just really struggle to make progress. So we got a lot of different things going on out there. A lot of activity still to take place for the folks in our government, and they're some of the best in agriculture that can pick up the mantle and run with it.
When we talk about your new role and looking ahead and kind of having some foresight or trying to think one step ahead of where the industry is going, what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities when we look at the future of the ag sector in general, and some great growth points and some areas that we need to make sure we're highlighting?
Well, I got to begin to formulate this, what I have in my mind here. But one of the things that I have in my mind is, we've gone 6 months here in our ability to export soybeans and corn and wheat and grain sorghum, where we've almost completely, or have completely maxed out our ability to export these bulk ag commodities. We have run months here where we physically couldn't load another boat if we had to. We were completely maxing out our infrastructure. So if we're going to increase our acreage, increase our yields, there's going to be increased opportunity for us to export these products to China and other places. We've got to go back and think about our infrastructure and have a conversation about where are the ways that we can increase what we're exporting. And we have to keep in mind that we have a window. We have a big competitor in Brazil now, and they've got their window and we've got our window. And so we've got to, as the old Kansas saying goes, you've got to make hay while the sun is shining. In our window, we've got to be able to utilize our capacity and our infrastructure to the best we possibly can, and or consider how to expand it. The other side of this equation that I think has enormous potential is meat. And here's the statistic. I know I can throw all kinds of charts at you, but here's the number. 2 years ago, China imported $11 billion worth of beef, pork, and poultry. In 2020, folks, they imported $28 billion from the world in beef, pork, and poultry. That's the growth of which we haven't seen ever on that side of the equation. And we really everybody has to understand that. I remind people all the time, when you're exporting poultry or pork, you're not just exporting poultry and pork, you're also exporting little piles of corn and soybean meal, right? And that's because that's what those things are. And we have to look at that from a value-added perspective and our ability to maximize that as well.
It's one of the most exciting things that came out of that China deal, the opportunity and the door it opens for U.S. beef. We talk about pork going to China, and we can talk about it all day long. It's fantastic. But the fact that U.S. beef now has access, I think, is one of the greatest untapped potentials for the industry.
Well, this was a huge emphasis of mine on the meat side with China. And I want everybody to understand, it wasn't China's resistance. In our conversations, the vice minister was like, look, Greg, we know that you've got the best, safest food supply in the world. We know you've got a great regulatory system. What we spent hours and hours and hours with them was helping them understand our regulatory system versus them seeing it through the eyes of their own regulatory system, which is incredibly, just vastly different. So it's like two ships passing in the night. How are we going to get these things to come together? And it took hundreds of hours of conversations to make that happen. But we made enormous, we didn't fix everything, but we made enormous progress here. And I think at the end of it, we changed things in a way that were historic. I focus on this one comment is when the vice minister and I were signing a couple of the side agreements after the signing ceremony in the White House. We were in the red room at the White House, and he looked at me and he said, Greg, China's never done this with any other country in the world. And I looked at him and I said, Vice Minister, neither have we. And I think he and I both had we known at the time what we were getting ourselves into, I don't know what we would have done. But at the end of it, he and I both realized the monumental changes that were going to come about as a result of our conversations. And the 40 or 50 people in the Chinese government behind him that were technical people, and the unbelievable 20 or 30 people that I had behind me the whole time, going through these conversations, soup to nuts, in an incredibly successful way at the end of the day.
I want to take a step back. You talked about infrastructure, and we know, I think about roadways, bridges, locks and dams, and that type of infrastructure. How much focus do we need to have on building rural broadband infrastructure, especially coming off of the heels of 2020?
It's a great question. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a little time off here. And so I hopped in the car with Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas's new ag team. And we drove something like 1,400 miles over 4 or 5 days all over Kansas. We made like 18 stops. And of course, that's home for me. So I just had a blast. But I was shocked at every one of these little 18 meetings. From those discussions, I will tell you, I think the number one thing that I heard that week was rural broadband. Of all the things that we could have talked about, that always came back to me as kind of the number one thing that we've got to focus on in rural America. And it's right. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We couldn't do this without a tremendous internet connection. And I'm frankly, from my perspective, I'm fascinated to watch this Starlink thing, this new Elon Musk thing with satellites here. And I know North Dakota's working, got some stuff going on that now, and folks using it. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming here. We have got to have this in rural America to be successful. You're exactly right.
I go home to my family farm in central Illinois, and my husband and I will drive off of the interstate, and we have 2 miles, and we won't have cell phone reception the entire weekend while we're back there, because my folks live in literally like a black hole in central Illinois for broadband and cell phone connectivity. And I think about the struggles of families and those who have young kids who are trying to do at-home learning, and the equipment. We have so much technology in agriculture, and to be sidelined or slowed from not having connectivity or access to connectivity.
Well, I will tell you, I'm 25 miles from the capital of the United States, right here where I'm sitting right now, on a horse farm in a rural area. And it wasn't until just 5 years ago that through USDA's Rural Broadband Initiative, we were able to have a high-speed internet access right here, 25 miles from the nation's capital. So it isn't, you don't have to get that, to your point, you do not have to get that far off of any interstate of the United States to have that problem.
Gregg, I appreciate your time today, your insight, your thoughts. Any closing comments before I let you go this afternoon?
Well, I think, really what's exciting for me now, spending the time that I've spent in government, and of course, this was my second stint in government. And this is America. In government, I was dealing with folks that were 30 years career trade negotiators. Our system as government is very different. As we have, private citizens, they come into government, they do these jobs, they come back out. I have an incredibly unique perspective now on things. And I'm in a great position now to work with folks in the agricultural sector to take that experience and say, okay, how do we think about these things, and how do we improve what we're doing going forward from an intelligence standpoint? And it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you.
I appreciate your time this afternoon.
My pleasure.
That's former Chief Ag Negotiator with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, Gregg Doud. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.